I'm John Sharp, Professor of Interactive Design and Game Development at SCAD Atlanta.
And I'm Ian Bogus, Professor at Georgia Tech.
And my name is Michael Lynch, also Professor at Georgia Tech.
So what we're going to do for about a half hour is tell you why we drug you all to Atlanta for the next 3 days, or at least we're going to try to do that. But before we start, we thought we'd share a little anecdote with you. The slide we have up on the screen here. The three of us did a panel not so different than what we're about to do tonight back at SIGGRAPH in August. And because SIGGRAPH is, a lot of serious egghead programmers and mathematicians and that sort, we thought we ought to have some statistics in our presentation.
Because everybody had.
Statistics and numbers and formulas. So anyway, we made up this statistic and we put it up on the screen. And we then saw this tweet.
We really hope that whoever tweeted this is not in the room tonight, so that we don't embarrass him or her further. But it was interesting to see how willing someone was to accept that something like art could be measurable and down to the quarter percentage point. That this was a reasonable figure for accounting for the amount of artiness that exists in games.
So I immediately wanted to join the next myth and say that 31.7% of games are not art.
Well, these numbers have changed since August, of course.
Yeah.
And you guys can purchase the research report at the desk up front.
So anyway, to get started, we want to give you a very quick little nickel tour, if you will, of the next couple of days of what we'll be presenting to you all.
Right. So tonight, what we're going to do is introduce the event as we're doing right now, and then you're going to hear from someone you may have heard of, a guy named John Romero, who has some experience in this medium, and is going to give us I think a very different perspective than what you've maybe heard before from folks like him.
Mozart was a great person, great musician. Lived a long time ago, and he made a lot of music. Of his music, a lot of people don't know that we actually only have about 10% of his output, which is kind of scary. He was a brilliant person, and I'm sure that if we had more of his output, we would probably learn more about his genius. It's unfortunate that didn't happen. Imagine if Mozart were alive right now. What could we learn from Mozart if he was among us now, instead of having to look back on his past work? Louis Sullivan was an amazing architect. His buildings were very controversial when they came out. But Louis Sullivan was very inspirational for Frank Lloyd Wright in his career. And you can see a lot of Louis Sullivan in Mr. Wright's architecture. But he knew that that's where he got his inspiration. Right now, our masters walk among us in the game industry. Actually, this is a young industry, and it's not so old that a lot of our early masters from the early '80s, they're still here. And I think it's important for us to think about what they've done and for us to actually learn from them instead of just steadily marching forwards and looking at last year's games. Does anybody here know who Nasser Jebeli is? Yeah. A few hands out there. Nasser Jebeli is an Iranian programmer. And Nasser Jebeli was instrumental in the very early 80s, in fact in 1980, on the Apple II, basically creating really great games, like these ones that you see here, SpaceX and Phantom Spy, and a lot of other games. In fact, Nasser had created, I think, about 9 games in 1 year, furiously chain-smoking and drinking coffee and pounding out 650 assembly language. And he actually pounded out his assembly language in a mini assembler. He never actually had a program that he ran. and kept his source code in. He didn't have source code. He just typed directly into a mini assembler. And it was interesting that Nasser, because of the way that he operated, Nasser had to keep an entire game in his head. He couldn't just look back at source and have comments and kind of look and see, you know, what he was thinking a few days ago. He had to make his games pretty quick because it all had to be in his head. And to be able to write these kinds of games and keep it all in your head with no source code is on a crazy genius level almost. Even though the programming on the Apple II was not of the level of programming required to basically program a screen on the Atari 2600, creating a game the size of some of the stuff that Nasser had done required a lot of work and thought that people back then were not used to. Having. You know, the practice just was not common. So you know, he just did what he had to do, which is just iterate and build upon this code that he was building. It was interesting. He used to basically fill his memory up with no operation codes, and then just put pieces of code all over the place, so he could kind of extend his code out, and it would kind of fall through to the next piece of code. But yeah, it's interesting to look back at some of the techniques that he used to create his games. You know, the Apple II was a pretty limited system. It had a 1 megahertz processor, and it had no video adapters. It had basically a frame buffer, and you wrote pixels into that buffer. And you couldn't write them in a nice, friendly way on the bit level. Pixels were made up of a bit or 2 bits next to each other that did crazy things, and you know, you can kind of see from the Phantom Spy screen some fringing artifacts. The slowness of the machine basically dictated, you know, if you're going to do a full scrolling screen like Phantom Spy, you had to come up with some tricks. And what Nasser did, if you're looking at the Phantom Spy screen there, was he interlaced every other line for the background, and the other, let's say the even lines, were for the foreground moving objects, like the jet fighter that you flew around. And you know, those kinds of tricks were employed on other systems as well. It was not nice and neat and clean the way that you would like throw polys through an API today and just kind of you see the whole thing up on the screen.